We live in an age where the promise of heaven on earth has become the fundamental organizing principle of political movements. From progressive liberalism to Marxist revolution, from technocratic scientism to nationalist messianism, modern ideologies share a common structure that I have identified as the immanentization of the Eschaton, the attempt to realize within historical time what belongs properly to the transcendent realm. This represents perhaps the most dangerous spiritual disorder of our civilization, for it corrupts both the temporal order of politics and the eternal order of the soul. When men lose their openness to transcendent reality, they inevitably seek to create substitute forms of salvation within the closed system of material existence. The result is not the paradise they promise, but the hell of totalitarian control and spiritual destruction. Today, we must examine how this Gnostic impulse manifests in contemporary movements and why recognizing its structure is essential for preserving human dignity and authentic order. Chapter 1: The Gnostic Rebellion Against Reality. The phenomenon I call the immanentization of the Eschaton has its roots in the ancient Gnostic rebellion against the structure of reality itself. To understand modern ideologies, we must first grasp this fundamental pattern of consciousness that refuses to accept the tension of existence between time and eternity, between the temporal order and transcendent meaning. The Gnostic consciousness experiences the world as a prison from which escape is both necessary and possible through special knowledge. This knowledge promises not merely understanding, but transformation of reality itself. The Gnostic does not seek to participate in the divine order. Rather, he seeks to become divine himself, to transcend the limitations of finite existence through his own efforts. In ancient forms, this took the shape of elaborate cosmologies and spiritual practices aimed at liberating the divine spark within man from the corrupt material world. But in modernity, the Gnostic impulse has undergone a crucial transformation. No longer content with purely spiritual escape, the modern Gnostic seeks to transform the world itself into the realm of perfection. This is what I mean by immanentizing the Eschaton, bringing the end-time fulfillment down into historical time. The structure remains constant. There is a fundamental flaw in reality as it exists. This flaw can be overcome through special insight, and those who possess this insight are entitled, indeed, obligated, to remake the world according to their vision. Whether the flaw is identified as class exploitation, racial inequality, traditional authority, or technological backwardness, the pattern persists. What makes this particularly dangerous is that the Gnostic consciousness presents itself as the highest form of rationality and compassion. Who could oppose the elimination of suffering? Who would defend injustice against justice? The Gnostic movement cloaks its rebellion against reality in the language of humanitarian concern, making resistance appear cruel and unreasonable. Yet beneath this benevolent facade lies a profound hatred of existence as it is given to us. The Gnostic cannot accept that human life necessarily involves limitation, suffering, uncertainty, and death. He cannot tolerate the tension between our aspirations for the infinite and our finite condition. This intolerance drives him to seek final solutions that will eliminate not merely particular evils, but the very structure of existence that makes evil possible. The tragedy is that in attempting to eliminate the conditions that make evil possible, the Gnostic inevitably eliminates the conditions that make good possible as well. For genuine human excellence emerges precisely from our struggle with limitation, our choice between better and worse within the constraints of finite existence. When these constraints are abolished in the name of perfect freedom, freedom itself disappears. Chapter 2: The Secularization of Christian Eschatology. The modern forms of Gnostic immanentization draw their power from the secularization of Christian eschatological symbols. Christianity introduced into human consciousness a revolutionary understanding of history as moving toward a divine fulfillment, the kingdom of God, the New Jerusalem, the resurrection of the dead. These symbols expressed the truth that human existence points beyond itself toward transcendent completion. However, when faith in transcendent reality weakens, These same symbols become available for manipulation by movements that promise to realize the kingdom within purely mundane terms. The result is ideologies that retain the emotional power and ultimate concern of religious faith while directing them toward intramundane objects. Consider the Marxist vision of the classless society. Here we find all the elements of Christian eschatology translated into materialist terms. The present age of exploitation and alienation corresponds to the fallen world. The proletariat becomes the chosen people who will inherit the earth. The revolution serves as the apocalyptic moment of transformation, and the communist society represents the millennium of peace and justice. Even the role of the party parallels that of the church as the vehicle of salvation. Similarly, progressive liberalism promises the gradual realization of a society of perfect equality, tolerance, and human fulfillment through rational social engineering. The kingdom of God becomes the global democratic order. Salvation comes through education and institutional reform, and those who resist progress are cast in the role of forces of darkness opposing the light. The seductive power of these movements lies precisely in their appeal to the deepest human longings for meaning, justice, and fulfillment. They offer what Christianity offers, ultimate purpose and final resolution, but without the difficult requirements of faith, transcendence, and personal transformation that Christianity demands. Yet this secularization involves a crucial distortion. Christian eschatology always maintained the tension between the already and the not yet. The kingdom is present in principle but awaits fulfillment beyond history. This tension preserves human freedom and prevents the identification of any temporal order with final perfection. When this tension collapses, the result is the idolatrous identification of a particular political program with absolute truth and final salvation. The ideological movements promise certainty where Christianity offers hope, immediate realization where Christianity counsels patience, and perfect knowledge where Christianity acknowledges mystery. They eliminate the transcendent dimension that gives meaning to temporal existence by making temporal existence itself the sole realm of meaning. This secularization process explains why modern ideological conflicts take on the character of religious wars. When political movements claim to represent not merely better policies but ultimate truth and final salvation, compromise becomes impossible and opposition becomes not merely disagreement but heresy. The stakes become infinite because the claims are absolute. The irony is profound. In seeking to make the divine promises immediately accessible, the Gnostic consciousness loses access to the divine altogether. By refusing to accept the tension of existence between time and eternity, it creates a closed world in which transcendence becomes impossible and human existence loses its ultimate meaning. Chapter 3: The Progressive Promise of Earthly Salvation. Modern progressivism represents perhaps the most sophisticated and pervasive form of eschatological immanentization in our time. Unlike the crude revolutionary programs of the past century, contemporary progressivism presents itself as reasonable, gradual, and scientific. Yet beneath its moderate facade lies the same Gnostic structure, the promise that human effort can eliminate the fundamental conditions that cause suffering and create a perfect society within historical time. Examine the language of progress itself. We are told we are moving toward a society of perfect equality, where all forms of discrimination will be eliminated. We envision a world of universal prosperity, where technology will solve the problem of scarcity. We imagine a future of perfect health, where medical science will conquer disease and perhaps death itself. We anticipate complete knowledge, where scientific method will answer all questions and eliminate uncertainty from human existence. Each of these promises contains within it the Gnostic impulse to overcome the basic structure of human existence. Inequality is not merely a social problem to be ameliorated, but a fundamental flaw to be eliminated. Scarcity is not a condition requiring wisdom and virtue in its management, but an obstacle to be overcome through technique. Death is not the limit that gives urgency and poignancy to life, but a disease to be cured. What makes contemporary progressivism particularly seductive is its apparent reasonableness. Who would oppose better healthcare, expanded education, or reduced poverty? The problem lies not in these particular goals, but in the underlying assumption that such improvements can be extended indefinitely until they result in the perfect society. This assumption reveals itself in the progressive tendency to treat every remaining imperfection as a crisis requiring immediate and total solution. If some inequality persists, the entire system is condemned as unjust. If some suffering remains, society has failed in its fundamental purpose. The progressive consciousness cannot accept that improvement and perfection are different categories, that finite existence necessarily involves limitation and loss. Consider how you experience the promise of technological salvation in your daily life. Each new device promises to solve problems and enhance capabilities, yet somehow the fundamental human condition remains unchanged. We remain subject to mortality, limitation, uncertainty, and the need to choose between competing goods. The smartphone that was supposed to connect us to all knowledge often leaves us more anxious and isolated than before. Yet rather than questioning the underlying promise, the progressive response is always to demand more technology, more intervention, more systematic transformation. The failure of previous reforms to deliver the promised salvation is never taken as evidence that the promise itself might be flawed, but only as proof that the reforms were insufficient. This creates what I call the activist imperative, the demand for constant motion toward the promised end state. Since the goal is perfect society, any pause in movement toward this goal appears as stagnation or regression. The progressive consciousness cannot rest in the present, cannot accept that some degree of imperfection might be the permanent condition of human existence. The result is a politics of perpetual revolution disguised as reform. Each achievement becomes the launching point for more radical demands. The elimination of legal discrimination leads to demands for equality of outcome. The expansion of political rights leads to demands for economic rights, then cultural rights, then psychological rights. There can be no final stopping point because the logic demands nothing less than the complete reconstruction of human nature itself. Chapter 4: The Totalitarian Logic of Perfect Society. The attempt to create perfect society within historical time necessarily leads to totalitarian measures, for the simple reason that human beings in their natural state resist perfection. If society is to be made perfect, then the imperfect elements within it must be either transformed or eliminated. This is not an accidental feature of modern ideologies, but their logical consequence. Consider the progression that occurs in every attempt at systematic social transformation. It begins with the identification of a fundamental flaw in existing society, class exploitation, racial inequality, traditional authority, or whatever the movement defines as the root evil. The analysis appears rational and the proposed solutions reasonable: redistribute wealth, ensure equal representation, modernize institutions. But as the reforms proceed, resistance emerges. Some people benefit from existing arrangements and oppose change. Others question whether the proposed changes will actually achieve their stated goals. Still others raise concerns about unintended consequences. Most troubling of all, even those who support the reforms continue to exhibit the imperfect attitudes and behaviors that the reforms were supposed to eliminate. At this point, the movement faces a crucial choice. It can acknowledge that human nature and social reality are more complex than its original analysis suggested, scaling back its ambitions accordingly. Or it can conclude that the resistance itself proves the need for more systematic intervention. The Gnostic consciousness, committed to the possibility of perfect society, invariably chooses the latter course. The resistance is then redefined not as legitimate disagreement or natural human complexity, but as evidence of false consciousness, reactionary attitudes, or malicious opposition to progress. Those who resist are no longer fellow citizens with different opinions. but obstacles to the realization of truth and justice. This redefinition is crucial because it justifies increasingly coercive measures as necessary for the greater good. We have seen this pattern repeatedly in the totalitarian movements of the past century. The Bolsheviks began with reasonable-sounding promises of workers' rights and economic justice. When opposition emerged, it was labeled as bourgeois reaction that had to be suppressed for the revolution to succeed. When the suppression of opposition failed to produce the promised results, the explanation was always that the suppression had been insufficient, that more systematic measures were needed. The same logic operates in contemporary movements, though often in subtler forms. When diversity training fails to eliminate unconscious bias, the response is more comprehensive training, more systematic monitoring, more thorough intervention in private attitudes and behaviors. When economic redistribution fails to eliminate inequality, the demand is for more radical redistribution, more systematic control over market outcomes. The progression is always toward more complete control because the goal, perfect society, admits of no compromise. If some inequality remains, the society is still imperfect. If some prejudice persists, the transformation is incomplete. If some suffering continues, the system has failed its ultimate test. This logic explains why movements that begin with appealing humanitarian goals so often end in oppression. It is not that the original intentions were insincere, but that the goal of perfect society makes compromise with imperfection impossible. Every remaining flaw becomes evidence of insufficient commitment to the cause. Every critic becomes an enemy of progress. Every limitation on governmental power becomes an obstacle to necessary reform. The tragedy is that this dynamic operates not only in explicitly totalitarian movements, but in any political program that promises final solutions to the human condition. The moderate progressive who simply wants to reduce inequality and the radical revolutionary who seeks to eliminate it entirely are separated not by different principles, but only by different estimates of how much control is needed to achieve their shared goal. Chapter 5: The Destruction of Intermediate Institutions. The immanentization of the Eschaton requires the destruction of all intermediate sources of meaning and authority that might compete with the ideological movements claimed to represent ultimate truth. Traditional institutions, family, church, local community, voluntary associations, must be weakened or eliminated because they provide alternative centers of loyalty and meaning that interfere with total commitment to the cause. This process often disguises itself as liberation. The family is criticized as a site of oppression and inequality. Religious institutions are condemned as sources of superstition and prejudice. Local communities are dismissed as narrow and exclusionary. Voluntary associations are seen as potential centers of privilege and discrimination. Each criticism contains elements of truth, for all human institutions are imperfect and can become corrupted. But observe the pattern. The solution proposed is never the reform of these institutions, but their replacement by centralized administration guided by enlightened principles. The imperfect family is to be superseded by professional childcare and education. The flawed church is to be replaced by scientific understanding of human nature. The limited local community is to be absorbed into the universal state. Voluntary associations are to be regulated out of existence or transformed into instruments of official policy. The justification is always the same: these intermediate institutions stand in the way of creating a rational, just, and efficient society. They perpetuate outdated attitudes, create unfair advantages, and prevent the systematic implementation of progressive principles. Their elimination is presented not as loss, but as liberation from artificial constraints on human potential. Yet these intermediate institutions serve crucial functions that cannot be replaced by bureaucratic administration. They provide the human-scale communities within which individuals develop their capacity for responsibility, loyalty, and love. They transmit cultural wisdom across generations. They create spaces for genuine participation in common life. Most importantly, they maintain the tension between universal principles and particular circumstances that makes genuine prudence possible. When these institutions are destroyed in the name of universal justice, the result is not liberation but atomization. Individuals become isolated units confronting the overwhelming power of the state apparatus. They lose the mediating structures that previously allowed them to participate meaningfully in public life and that provided sources of identity and purpose beyond their immediate personal desires. Consider how this process manifests in your own experience. Notice how many of the traditional sources of meaning and community in American life have been weakened or transformed beyond recognition. The extended family scattered by economic mobility and cultural change. Religious congregations divided by political controversy or emptied by secular alternatives. Neighborhood communities replaced by virtual networks. Civic associations superseded by professional advocacy organizations funded by foundations and staffed by credentialed experts. Each change appears rational when considered individually. Geographic mobility increases economic opportunity. Religious authority should not go unquestioned. Professional expertise produces better outcomes than amateur enthusiasm. Virtual networks can connect like-minded people across vast distances. But the cumulative effect is the creation of a society in which most people have no meaningful participation in any community smaller than the nation-state and larger than the nuclear family. This atomization serves the purposes of ideological movements perfectly. Isolated individuals are much more susceptible to mass persuasion than people embedded in stable communities with their own traditions and sources of authority. When people have no meaningful participation in intermediate institutions, they become available for mobilization by movements that promise to restore their sense of purpose and community through participation in grand historical projects. The irony is profound. The destruction of intermediate institutions in the name of eliminating oppression creates the conditions for a much more systematic and total form of oppression. When people have no sources of identity and meaning other than their relationship to the central authority, that authority becomes unlimited in its claims upon their loyalty and obedience. The recovery of authentic order requires the restoration of these intermediate institutions, not as perfect solutions to human problems, but as necessary buffers between the individual and the state, as schools for citizenship, and as repositories of practical wisdom about how human beings can live together despite their limitations and differences. Chapter 6: The Classical Understanding of Order and Limitation. The classical philosophers understood what the modern Gnostic consciousness refuses to accept, that human existence necessarily involves limitation, that perfect society is impossible within historical time, and that the attempt to achieve such perfection destroys the very goods it claims to seek. This understanding provides the foundation for authentic political order that can resist the totalitarian temptations of immanentized eschatology. Aristotle recognized that the polis exists not to create perfect human beings, but to provide the framework within which imperfect human beings can pursue excellence according to their limited capacities. The good society does not eliminate the tragic conflicts between competing values, but creates institutions that allow these conflicts to be resolved through prudential judgment rather than force. Politics is the art of the possible, not the science of the perfect. Plato's Republic is often misunderstood as a blueprint for utopian society, but careful reading reveals it as a demonstration of why perfect justice cannot be achieved through political means. The perfectly just city requires the elimination of private property, family life, and individual freedom, in other words, the destruction of everything that makes human life worth living. The dialogue shows that the pursuit of perfect justice leads necessarily to tyranny. The classical understanding recognizes that human nature itself sets limits on what political action can achieve. Human beings are neither angels who require no government nor devils who cannot be governed, but complex creatures capable of both virtue and vice, reason and passion, cooperation and conflict. Any political order that assumes it can eliminate these tensions through systematic intervention will end by destroying human nature itself. This recognition leads to a fundamentally different approach to political problems. Instead of seeking final solutions, classical politics seeks provisional arrangements that allow human flourishing within the constraints of mortality, scarcity, and moral complexity. Instead of promising the elimination of suffering, it aims at the creation of conditions within which suffering can be borne with dignity and limitation can become the occasion for excellence. Consider how this applies to the contemporary obsession with equality. The classical perspective recognizes that human beings are unequal in countless ways, in talent, virtue, circumstance, and fortune. Some inequality is unjust and should be corrected where possible. But the attempt to create perfect equality requires constant intervention in human affairs that ultimately destroys freedom, initiative, and the very diversity that makes human life interesting and valuable. The classical approach seeks not perfect equality, but proportional justice, giving to each what is appropriate given their circumstances, contributions, and needs. This cannot be reduced to a formula that can be applied mechanically, but requires the prudential judgment of citizens who understand both universal principles and particular circumstances. Recovery of this classical wisdom requires what I call anamnesis, the recollection of fundamental experiences that modernity has forgotten but that remain available to consciousness willing to undertake the discipline of philosophical investigation. These experiences include the tension between time and eternity that gives meaning to human existence, the participation in transcendent order that grounds authentic authority, and the recognition of limitation that makes genuine excellence possible. Such recollection is not a matter of returning to ancient political forms, which would be neither possible nor desirable, but of recovering the experiential basis that made classical insights into order possible. This experiential basis remains constant across historical changes because it is grounded in the permanent structure of human consciousness and its relationship to reality. The practical implications are significant. Politics guided by classical understanding will be more modest in its claims, more respectful of traditional wisdom, more cautious about systematic reform, and more attentive to the unintended consequences of well-intentioned policies. It will seek to preserve the conditions that allow human excellence to emerge rather than trying to guarantee specific outcomes. Most importantly, such politics will maintain the distinction between temporal and eternal order, refusing both the cynical reduction of all values to power and the Gnostic inflation of political goals into matters of ultimate concern. Chapter 7: Resistance and the Recovery of Transcendent Order. The resistance to Gnostic immanentization cannot be merely political, because the disorder we face is fundamentally spiritual. It requires the recovery of openness to transcendent reality and the cultivation of what I call islands of order, communities of people committed to living according to the truth of human existence rather than the illusions of ideological consciousness. Such resistance begins with the recognition that the crisis of our time is not primarily a matter of bad policies or corrupt institutions, but of a deformation of consciousness that closes human beings off from the sources of authentic meaning and order. This deformation cannot be corrected through political action alone, but requires the patient work of philosophical and spiritual recovery. The first step is intellectual, the recognition that modern ideological movements, despite their apparent diversity, share a common structure that I have analyzed as Gnostic. Whether the movement promises salvation through economic redistribution, technological progress, cultural transformation, or national greatness, the underlying pattern remains the same. Understanding this pattern provides immunity against the emotional appeals and moral blackmail that such movements use to recruit supporters. But intellectual understanding alone is insufficient. The Gnostic appeals are so powerful because they speak to genuine human longings for meaning, justice, and transcendence. These longings cannot be eliminated, only redirected toward their proper objects. This requires the cultivation of experiences of transcendent order that provide alternative sources of meaning to the immanent substitutes offered by ideology. For many, this will involve recovery of traditional religious faith that maintains the tension between time and eternity, finite and infinite, human effort and divine grace. But even for those who cannot embrace traditional religious forms, the philosophical investigation of consciousness can provide access to experiences of transcendent meaning that break the spell of Gnostic promises. The creation of islands of order requires practical as well as theoretical work. We must build communities, whether families, congregations, schools, or voluntary associations, that embody principles of authentic order rather than merely critiquing the disorders around us. Such communities become centers of resistance not through political opposition, but through the demonstration that alternative ways of living remain possible. Consider what this means in your own life. Every act of genuine love, every moment of contemplative silence, every exercise of practical wisdom in particular circumstances becomes a form of resistance against the totalitarian claims of ideological consciousness. When you choose to strengthen family bonds rather than sacrifice them to career advancement, when you participate in community life rather than retreating into private consumption, when you seek truth rather than merely winning arguments, you create small but significant spaces where authentic order can flourish. These islands of order serve multiple functions. They preserve knowledge and practices that might otherwise be lost during periods of civilizational crisis. They provide examples that inspire others who have grown weary of ideological promises. They create networks of mutual support that can survive the collapse of larger institutional structures. Most importantly, they maintain the experiential basis for recovering authentic order when the current disorders have exhausted themselves. The restoration of transcendent order does not require the conversion of entire societies, though we should hope and work for such conversion where possible. It requires only that enough people in each generation maintain access to the sources of authentic meaning in order to serve as leaven for the whole. Even in the darkest periods of history, such faithful minorities have preserved the possibility of renewal. This perspective provides both realism about the depth of our current crisis and hope about the possibilities for recovery. The Gnostic movements of our time will ultimately fail because they promise what cannot be delivered and attempt what cannot be achieved. The question is whether their failure will lead to the emergence of more authentic forms of order or simply to new forms of Gnostic illusion. Our task is to ensure that when the current ideologies collapse under the weight of their own contradictions, there will be communities of people who have maintained contact with the permanent sources of human order and can guide the work of reconstruction. This is not a political program but a civilizational responsibility that each person must take up according to their circumstances and calling. Conclusion. The immanentization of the Eschaton represents the fundamental spiritual disorder of our age, manifesting in ideologies that promise heaven on earth while delivering various forms of hell. Whether in revolutionary or reformist guise, these movements share the Gnostic structure that refuses to accept the permanent tension between temporal existence and transcendent meaning. Recognition of this pattern provides the foundation for authentic resistance, not merely political opposition, but the spiritual and intellectual work of recovering openness to transcendent order. This recovery requires both the philosophical investigation of consciousness and the practical creation of communities that embody principles of authentic order. The promise of perfect society within historical time will always appeal to human longings for meaning and justice. But those who understand the permanent structure of human existence know that our fulfillment lies not in the elimination of limitation and suffering, but in the transcendent dimension that gives meaning to our temporal struggles. In every generation, the choice presents itself anew: will we seek salvation through participation in transcendent order, accepting the tension and uncertainty this involves? Or will we succumb to Gnostic promises that offer certainty and fulfillment at the cost of our humanity? The future of civilization depends upon this choice.